Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to an in-depth review on the new Star Wars Battlefront II, sequel to the gorgeous but content-lacking Battlefront 1. And to me, that's what makes this such an interesting one to review, because although we have almost double the content, I think most people would still agree that all of it should have been there to begin with. So, that begs the question. Despite the increase in content, is this one really worth it? And to answer that question, let's go ahead and start with the visuals. Just like the first Battlefront, this game looked remarkably impressive. And I don't think that's going to come off as a surprise to anyone, but what really did it for me this time around were the awesome set pieces that made up the various maps. And that was in both the campaign and multiplayer. Especially when it came to some of the really well done crash sites. Not only did it feel like each one told a story, but that, and the way the rest of the locations were put together, truly made it feel like I was in the Star Wars universe. And I think some people out there may even go as far as saying, this is one of the best looking games ever made. And to an extent, I'd have to agree. But I also ran into a few visual nuances that kept that from being completely true. For example, any sort of depth of field was pretty much non-existent, making faraway objects look way too sharp and jagged. And then other important components, like the lighting, looked fairly washed out on some of the multiplayer maps and single-player levels. Plus, the game also had its fair share of other issues like object pop-in, and strange design choices like putting the blinding sun right in your face while trying to defend on maps like Kashyyyk. That said, I honestly can't stress enough how good the textures in this game were. To me, they had to be hands down some of the best I'd ever seen, and it was actually somewhat jaw-dropping getting to see how realistic everything was. I mean, all of it down to the smallest detail seemed as if it was handled with the utmost care. And when you mix that level of detail with other elements, like the small array of wildlife, and the fact that the brush even moved around as you walked through it, you end up with this incredibly believable world. And this would have had the potential to be one of the most immersive shooters out there, had it not been for the almost intolerable heads-up display. I'm really not kidding when I say there is way too much shit on screen. So much so that they should have just called the game Star Wars Battlefront II, because there actually are plenty of moments online where enemies will get completely covered by certain icons on screen, to the point where you'll end up fighting the damn HUD more than the real bad guys. And even during the campaign, although not anywhere near as bad, you get crap where enemies end up with these unnecessary icons over their heads, more or less ripping you away from any sense of immersion that you might have had. And worst of all, there were hardly any options to tone it down. You could either turn everything off, making you virtually useless, or you could toggle off a couple of options that had little to no effect. Which really was a shame, because you'll see in some of the background footage that the difference between the two really is night and day, and sadly there isn't any reasonable middle ground. Luckily, even with all of the settings maxed out, I was getting well over 60 frames, and that was on what I would consider to be a fairly average rig these days. All that said, yes, the game itself looks gorgeous, but if you were like me and maybe looking to both immerse yourself and still do well online, I'm not sure you're going to be able to find that experience here. Or at least, not until they fix some of these issues. Graphics aside, let's go ahead and move on to the gameplay to see if maybe this category can make up any lost ground. And first things first, let's talk about the overall fun factor. For me, this actually fluctuated quite a bit, and for the most part, yeah, the game could be pretty enjoyable, especially when cutting through enemies as any one of the game's many heroes. But oftentimes that constant thrill I was hoping for never really kicked in, mainly due to poor map design, where levels looked great and felt like their film counterparts, but simply didn't function well or feel competitive, and they were oftentimes either too empty or ended up being a complete clusterfuck. Now, that's not to say it was all bad. For instance, I was pleasantly surprised to see such a wide array of maps, spanning from classics like Tatooine all the way to newer ones like Starkiller Base. And the same goes for the heroes as well. This time around, we get a total of 14 plus 9 hero ships, such as Vader's TIE Fighter or the Slave One. Unfortunately, even though I would consider this to be a fair amount, due to the game covering all 3 film eras, you end up with a lot of hero crossover, where characters like Darth Maul can end up on Hoth fighting someone like Rey. So hopefully in the future we end up seeing additions such as Obi-Wan, General Grievous, and much more to help get rid of this problem and possibly provide a more authentic experience. To an extent though, the multiplayer and even the campaign for that matter offered a ton of variety, in the sense that one moment you could be unleashing hell with a lightsaber, and the next you might be flying around in an X-Wing or blowing guys up in an AT-AT. By the way, for multiplayer, players now have a total of 5 game modes, though realistically the only 2 that have a major impact are Galactic and Starfighter Assault, as they tend to offer the larger scale battles and of course, the space combat, which for the most part has been much improved, and actually became my favorite game mode. Sadly, a lack of maneuvers, such as the ability to strafe, made it near impossible to escape enemies on your tail, or ones right in front of you for that matter. And ship hitboxes also seem to be a bit too big, so pilots normally skilled enough to fly close to objects will now be punished for doing so. Nonetheless, it was still a good amount of fun, and finally getting to fight on a huge scale alongside capital ships was well worth it. Also, for any ground combat, issues from the previous game, such as enemies spawning right on top of each other, have been completely removed, though as a trade-off, we end up with this odd new squad system that ends up being somewhat pointless, and may even limit players trying to group up with friends. Another weird thing was movement also felt quite a bit slower than the original, and weapons also had quite a bit more kick, which I can't say I was a huge fan of. That said, any issues mentioned so far really do pale in comparison to this game's horrid reward system that ends up leaving so much to be desired, as instead of providing an interesting armor system where players could unlock cool new cosmetics, such as outfits, we end up getting a completely worthless loot box system that rewards players with repulsive star card garbage that looks more like something you'd see in a free-to-play game than a full $60 title, which rightly is a huge letdown. And nowadays, one of the main things a game like this needs in order to be successful is a proper progression system that keeps players coming back for more. And let me tell you, this is far from that. And no, I'm not saying we need a bunch of pink stormtroopers running around, but take a moment to imagine how much cooler it would have been if players could unlock all kinds of new outfits, like Leia's bounty hunter gear from episode 6, or simply blood-stained and battle-scarred clone armor just by completing challenges or leveling up. Overall, even though I'd say it's pretty clear that there's far more to do this time around than there was in the first Battlefront, due to glaring issues like the progression system and multiple crashes, the quality of that extra content becomes somewhat tainted and felt unfulfilling. And you know, we're still missing fan-favorite modes such as Galactic Conquest, where players could actually land ships and board enemy vessels. And that was a thing all the way back in 2005. But who knows, maybe it's one more thing on their list of future plans. And that leads us into our next category, which is sound. And for this, I would honestly say It made me feel as if I was in the Star Wars universe, just as much as the visuals did. The most important thing was that everything sounded authentic and as close to the films as possible, so effects like explosion and blaster fire had a real impact. And the same goes for vehicles as well. And man oh man, the music is fantastic. Now, they don't really do anything new here, but it's because of that we get a really convincing Star Wars experience that's at least enjoyable to listen to. Hell, even a lot of the heroes' voices ended up sounding really accurate, which oddly I wasn't expecting, considering how off some of them were in the first game. And speaking of that, the voice acting throughout the campaign was also really well done.
The ship we rescued on Fondor, why is it here?
Well, it's delivering cargo. It was carrying those satellites. Moff Wraith said they were needed for Operation Cinder. But he wouldn't tell us the target.
Neither would the Admiral. Now I know why.
It did get a little bit dull at times, but for the most part, you could always get a pretty good sense of how each character was feeling during heightened moments of the story. And overall, whether you were zooming around on a tauntaun or simply running through water, the game's amazing sound design did an awesome job in enhancing the whole experience. And now, without mentioning any major spoilers, let's move on to the story. After beating it, I have to say that in general it was pretty fun. Definitely far from perfect, but it seems like DICE made a real effort to make sure the single player wasn't for nothing. Initially, you play as Iden Versio, leader of Inferno Squad, offering players an interesting perspective of the events that occurred between episodes 6 and 7. And keep in mind, this is all canon now. That said, what we end up getting as the overarching story is the same thing everybody sort of knew they would go for, but nobody really wanted. And because of that, the campaign turns out to be incredibly cliché. And the main character does a complete 180 that's borderline cringeworthy.
Tell me, Aiden, what is the source of their belief?
Hope. Senator Organa. It's been a while.
Honestly, instead of doing this overdone narrative where the main character quickly turns good, it would have been really cool to see her stay loyal to the Empire, just because that's such a unique perspective that we don't see all that often in the Star Wars universe. I mean, come on, we just saw this exact same scenario with Finn in episode 7. They couldn't have done anything new? On the bright side though, this does allow for you to interact with some old faces like Lando Calrissian, and you even get a chance to play as some of these characters during various parts of the story. And to me, part of what made the movies so special were the side characters like the bounty hunters and creatures like the Wampa, because they added so much life to the story and made the universe feel bigger than it really was. And believe it or not, you actually get some stuff like that here, which was not something I was expecting at all. Now, I wouldn't say it's played out anywhere near as good, but once again, little things like that tend to add so much to a story, and I'm just glad they had some, rather than none at all. Not to mention, they even throw in a few of those crazy Star Wars tropes, like where pressing random buttons doesn't seem to work, so you just shoot the damn thing and somehow that does the trick. Unfortunately, the story is ultimately held back in quality by some really weird design choices. For instance, even when the campaign tries to give you a great sense of scale, it's spoiled by some horrible map boundaries, and you end up getting so many 10-second timers that you'll feel like a kid again on the brink of being thrown in timeout. And on top of that, you have other missteps, such as brain-dead AI, who are dumber than rocks. And the campaign is also plagued by these stereotypical fight X number of waves while so-and-so gets a timer to tick down moments. Perhaps even more questionable is the writing, which was all over the place. And again, it's not all bad. For instance, some of the more comedic and emotional moments worked fairly well, and even made me chuckle a time or two. But amongst all that, you have other aspects like a god-awful comedic relief character, Takudana, who might have been worse than Jar Jar Binks. And let me clarify, that's really tough to do. Hell, they even have the nerve to throw in some blatant sequel bait at the very end, as if this mediocre story really deserved it. And by the time you're finished, elements like that just feel forced. No pun intended. So all in all, although I'd have to say the story was worth having, it still has a long ways to go before it ever reaches the quality of storytelling that you see in some of the films, or other games for that matter. With all of that out of the way though, it's time to give this game a final rating. And at least for now, that's going to be a 6 out of 10. It made some great improvements following the disappointing release of Battlefront 1, but until this game goes on sale or receives more content, I simply cannot recommend it to anyone who wasn't a massive fan of the first game. That said, once this game receives all of its free DLC, or for the love of God, decides to replace those awful loot boxes with something more meaningful, we might be looking at more of a 7 out of 10 here. Until then though, it's probably best to stay away. And that just about wraps things up for today, so thanks for watching, hopefully you did enjoy the review, and as always guys, I will see you in the next one.